At age 11 they began singing together. They didn't talk to each other for decades. We now understand why. Art Garfunkel got all the praise while Paul Simon wrote all the songs. Simon did something terrible when he finally lost it. He took Garfunkel's voice off of their comeback record and put it out as his own work. But that wasn't the real point where things broke. There was something much more personal going on. Paul Simon first saw Art Garfunkel sing in a fourth-grade talent show at Public School 164 in Queens in 1953. He was only 11 years old at the time. They lived just a few blocks away in an area that was mostly Jewish. It wasn't until a sixth-grade play of Alice in Wonderland that they really got to know each other. Paul was the white rabbit. Art looked like a Cheshire cat. Art remembers that he thought Paul was the coolest, funniest, and smartest kid in school. Their shared love of music brought them together right away. They would listen to the radio for hours on end, taking in the new rock and roll sounds. They quickly got together with some friends to start a small street corner singing group which they called the Peptones. They worked on duets and learned how to make their voices sound good together. Soon they were acting together at school events, which was the start of the relationship that would make them famous one day. They chose to record a song called Hey School Girl in 1957 when they were both only 15 years old. They got $25 together and went to Manhattan's Sanders recording studio. They had good luck. A music producer named Sid Prozin heard them and liked what he heard. He talked their parents into letting him sign the boys to Big Records, his own record label. After seeing the cartoon, they came up with the catchy name Tom and Jerry. They were thrilled when a famous DJ played their song on the radio. Hey School Girl made it onto the Billboard lists and sold more than 100,000 copies. Back then it was a big deal that they got to be on American Bandstand. But that early spark didn't quickly turn into long-term success. Their next songs didn't do well, and people stopped being as excited about them. It was still a taste of what could be. Their relationship wasn't always hard even before they became famous. Years before, in 1958, there was a terrible event that neither of them would forget. Once they were done with high school, both of them chose to go to college in case their singing dreams didn't come true. Paul Simon went to Queens College to study English, and Art Garfunkel first studied design at Columbia University but later switched to art history. At that time they were still signed to big records as Tom and Jerry. Simon went by the name Jerry Landis and Garfunkel went by the name Tom Graff. But Simon did something that made their friendship fall apart. He recorded and put out a solo song under the fake name True Taylor without telling Garfunkel. True or False was a secret song release. When Garfunkel learned about it, he felt lied to. It would come back to them. Over the years the pain lingered. Even decades later, Simon admitted the memory still stung, especially when he remembered Garfunkel once saying, "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." Time went by and the early 1960s folk revival in America gave them a reason to reconnect. The era was shifting from polished pop to more heartfelt, raw folk music. In 1963, 5 years after their breakup, they began performing together again. But quietly. They avoided using their real names, instead calling themselves Kane and Gar. They played small Greenwich Village venues like Gerda's Folk City. Everything changed when Tom Wilson, a prominent African-American jazz producer helping Bob Dylan transition to rock, caught their show. Wilson saw potential and arranged a studio audition. There they performed The Sound of Silence, a haunting song Simon had written in his bathroom, lights off, water running to set the mood. They signed with Columbia Records under their real names and started over. The timing was ideal. Folk music was growing more introspective and political, just as Simon's lyrics were becoming more thoughtful. But their first official album fell flat. Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., released in October 1964, barely sold only 3,000 copies. The label misjudged the market, branding it exciting new sounds in the folk tradition right as British rock bands like the Beatles surged in popularity. Most of the tracks weren't Simon originals, and the album quickly felt outdated. Disappointed, Simon moved to England to pursue a solo path. Garfunkel returned to Columbia University to study mathematics. It looked like the end. Simon even recorded a solo album while in London. They had both moved on, or so they believed. Then something unexpected occurred. In spring 1965, college radio stations in Boston and Florida began playing the original version of The Sound of Silence. Tom Wilson noticed. Without consulting the duo, he remixed the track, adding electric guitar, bass and drums using session musicians. But the result was rough, because the original recording had tempo issues. The musicians struggled to keep time. Engineer Roy Haley added echo effects to mask the inconsistencies. In September, while Simon was performing in Denmark, he heard that the song was climbing US charts. When he finally listened to it, he was appalled. He thought it sounded clumsy and uneven, but the public disagreed. The track hit #1 on January 1, 1966 after 14 weeks on the Billboard Hot 100. Overnight, Simon and Garfunkel became famous. They were quickly brought back together to record a new album, Sounds of Silence, capitalizing on the surprise success. By October 1966, they released their third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme, a major turning point. It remained on the Billboard charts for nearly 3 years and sold over 3 million copies. It marked their first time using an 8-track recording system, allowing them to layer vocals cleanly without Simon's guitar interfering. The result was a sleeker sound, but behind the scenes problems emerged. Scarborough Fair, a traditional English folk tune, was something Simon had learned from Martin Carthy. Though it was centuries old, the track was credited solely to Simon and Garfunkel. Another song, Cloudy, co-written with Bruce Woodley of The Seekers, paid Woodley but gave him no credit. Despite these issues, the album was a massive success. It was later added to the Grammy Hall of Fame and ranked by Rolling Stone among the greatest albums of all time. In June 1967, Simon and Garfunkel performed at the Monterey Pop Festival, a pivotal cultural event featuring artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who. While others shattered guitars and lit them on fire, Simon and Garfunkel stood apart with their gentle, thoughtful folk sound. Some critics thought their style wasn't trendy enough, but their performance reminded the audience of folk's emotional roots. That same year, something unplanned shifted their careers in cinema history. Director Mike Nichols was working on The Graduate and decided to use their songs instead of a traditional score. Initially, Simon agreed to write 3 new tracks, but touring got in the way. So the editor used existing songs like The Sound of Silence and Scarborough Fair while cutting scenes. The songs fit so well, they stayed. The result, a massively successful soundtrack that rivaled the Beatles on the charts. Mrs. Robinson, the one new song written for the film, won Record of the Year. Their music gave the film emotional depth, and in return the film brought them a broader, older audience. It also changed how filmmakers approached music in cinema, yet behind their success, strain was growing. Simon wrote the songs and led the creative direction. Garfunkel mainly sang. Simon later admitted he felt the imbalance. During sessions, Garfunkel often stayed in the control room giving input, while Simon handled most of the work. This built resentment. Simon once confessed feeling jealous when crowds erupted for Garfunkel's soaring vocals and Bridge Over Troubled Water. "I wrote that," he thought, "that hurt went back to childhood." Simon recalled his mother telling him, "You have a good voice, Paul, but Arthur has a fine voice." That remark stung deeply. As their fame rose, Simon wrote every word, yet Garfunkel drew more applause. The imbalance grew unbearable. Garfunkel also struggled. He admitted years later that Simon stood in the way much of his life. He wanted to write songs too, but didn't think he could match Simon. He stayed quiet about it for decades. In the documentary In Restless Dreams, Garfunkel asks the difficult question, did he break up the group, or did Simon never make room for him? He believed they both shared responsibility. Eventually, Simon acknowledged their partnership was never equal. He wrote the songs, crafted the arrangements, and shaped the sound. Garfunkel mostly stayed in the control booth with the producer. Tensions reached a breaking point in early 1969 when they began working on what would be their final album. Around then, Garfunkel agreed to act in Catch-22, directed by Mike Nichols. Simon was also cast, but his role was cut. Filming began January 13 in Guaymas, Mexico, without Simon. Simon stayed in New York feeling abandoned. Director Charles Grodin later said that dropping one member of the duo was a mistake. "You don't take Simon and Garfunkel and drop one of their roles," he said. "You just don't." For Simon, it wasn't just about losing a movie role, it felt like losing a friend. When they finally spoke, Garfunkel explained he'd do movies for 6 months, then return to music. But Simon disagreed. "I'm not doing that," he recalled saying in the documentary. He already carried most of the creative load. Garfunkel's film shoot dragged on, and Simon pushed forward with Bridge Over Troubled Water alone. They exchanged notes across borders, but the collaboration suffered. Some tracks barely featured Garfunkel, on others he didn't appear at all. One song, The Only Living Boy in New York, was Simon's farewell, referring to their early pseudonyms. Tom Get Your Plane Right on Time captured Simon's loneliness and the emotional distance growing between them. Whenever they performed Bridge Over Troubled Water, something always cut Simon deeply. Garfunkel's vocals brought standing ovations. The praise was overwhelming, but it was for Garfunkel. Simon would quietly think, "I wrote that." In Restless Dreams, Simon opens up about how those moments hurt. He had given the vocal to Garfunkel because his choir-like tone was perfect, but it still stung. The world heard the voice, not the words behind it. It wasn't new pain, His mother's old comment, "Arthur has a fine voice," never left him. Every time critics celebrated Garfunkel's singing, that memory returned. Through the late 1960s, Simon kept writing hit after hit, but Garfunkel kept receiving more praise. That imbalance became unbearable. Yet Garfunkel had his own frustrations. He felt overshadowed. In an interview he said Simon was in the way for much of his life. He never offered his own songs to the duo because he didn't think they'd measure up. Only decades later did he begin writing and releasing his own work. In the documentary he wonders aloud, was it him who broke them up, or Simon who failed to include him? The truth was likely both. Things worsened during the making of Bridge Over Troubled Water. Garfunkel's absence during the long shoot in Mexico only widened the gap. Simon worked alone, sending demos and receiving delayed responses. Some songs lacked Garfunkel entirely. One in particular, "The Only Living Boy in New York," spoke to the emotional drift between them. It was quiet, but full of meaning. Then came their last performance as a duo. In summer 1970, at Forest Hill Stadium in Queens, they stood on stage together for what would be their final concert. The audience had no idea this would be the end of Simon and Garfunkel. The show was professional, but there was something distant in the air. Their usual banter was gone. After the second night, they parted with a simple goodbye. No blow-up, no announcement, just a quiet ending. Years later, Simon said, "With Artie, there was no reason to talk about it. It just ended." That single sentence says everything. The communication had broken long before the music stopped. Silence in the end was easier than honesty.